Without making a sound, I moved every last dime of my retirement and savings into a brand new account, leaving absolutely no trace. Late that afternoon, when I finally walked through the front door, my wife and stepson were already waiting for me in the living room, their eyes burning with pure rage. She screamed at me, asking what I had done with our money. I just stood there in the entryway like a fool, not fighting back, not explaining. I simply took a thick stack of papers and slapped it down onto the coffee table. 53 full pages of bank statements showing every single transaction laid out in broad daylight. Their faces froze instantly, turning as pale as sheet ghost. I really appreciate you being here today to listen to this story. Before we jump in, I'd love to know how you found this video. Was it a recommendation from a friend, the algorithm, or have you been following the channel for a while? Let me know in the comments. Your support means the world to me. Quick reminder, this narrative blends elements of fiction to offer both entertainment and something to reflect on. While names and places are fictionalized, the lessons about boundaries, self-respect, and financial independence are very real and worth thinking about. The woman behind the counter at the safety gear shop looked at me with that subtle, apologetic smile people get when they have bad news. I just handed her my card to buy a standard insulated harness, an absolute necessity for climbing high-voltage utility towers, coming out to $280. She swiped it, waited a second, and her smile flickered. She apologized and told me my card was declined due to insufficient funds. I stared at her, convinced I had heard her wrong. My work coveralls were still heavy, with the sharp smell of ozone, engine grease, and dried sweat. I had just come straight from an emergency repair job, my shift ending 30 minutes ago. Out in the howling storm of the Texas Panhandle, I had spent 14 straight hours hanging 80 feet in the air on high-voltage lines, and now she was telling me this? I told her that couldn't be right, that I had just received my storm overtime pay last Friday. She looked at the card reader, then back at me with genuine sympathy, asking if I wanted to try another card. I told her that was the only card I had. I'd been carrying it for 14 months, ever since Eleanor convinced me to deposit my entire paycheck into a joint account, saying it made managing household finances so much easier. I pulled $300 bills from my worn leather wallet, cash I kept for emergencies just like this. The clerk processed the payment quickly. I grabbed the harness and walked out into the freezing November Texas wind, my mind already racing with possibilities. A banking glitch? A system error? The drive home was supposed to be 30 minutes of relaxing, watching the last light fade over the plains. Instead, those 30 minutes turned into a slow climb of pure dread. $125,000. After everyday expenses, that's what should have been sitting in that account. The mortgage on our 50-acre ranch on the outskirts of Amarillo had been paid off years ago. How could a card be declined for a couple $100? I didn't sleep a wink that night. I lay in bed listening to Eleanor's steady, untroubled breathing beside me, while my brain frantically chased numbers in the dark. The morning was bitter cold. I left the house before sunrise, telling Eleanor I needed to check on a few things before work. She didn't even stir. First Credit Union of Texas didn't open until 8, but I was parked in their lot 15 minutes early, watching the clock tick down minute by minute. David Miller had been handling my account for 5 years. When he unlocked the doors and saw me waiting, he smiled, but I caught a flicker of something subtle in his eyes. He wished me a good morning and asked if everything was all right. I followed him inside and said I couldn't be sure yet, explaining that my card was declined yesterday and I needed him to pull up my account. He took his seat behind the desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I stood there with mud still clinging to my work boots, fully aware of how out of place I looked. My daily life was spent around tens of thousands of volts and punishing storms. A bank office felt like an alien world to me. For a brief second, his professional composure dropped. He told me my current balance was $314.20. That number hit me like a snapped power line. My ears started ringing. I started to say that couldn't be right, that my overtime pay alone was. Then I stopped calculating. $125,000, minus regular bills, meant there should have been well over six figures sitting there. I asked him if I could see the transaction history for the past 14 months. David nodded without another word. He keyed in a few commands, and the printer behind him started humming. The stack of paper coming out was far thicker than I expected. He gathered the pages and handed them across the desk. He quietly mentioned that it came out to 53 pages. Back in my pickup, I couldn't even bring myself to turn the key. The lot was filling up with morning rush hour traffic, people going about their lives as usual, while my world had completely shattered. I opened the folder and spread the first page across the steering wheel. The December transactions stared back at me in neat cold rows. Country club annual membership, $2,400. Luxury department store online shopping, $3,100. Direct transfer to someone named Chloe Davis, $800. A cash advance at 2:47 in the morning, $1,000. By the time I reached page 18, my hands were visibly trembling. Tulum Beach Resort, $8,500. A luxury vacation I had never taken. Another transfer to Chloe Davis, this time for $2,500, stamped at 3:14 in the morning. Like someone quietly siphoning funds in the middle of the night, confident I would never notice. High-end med spa visits, $1,200 drawn every month like clockwork. Lexus SUV lease, $850 a month. And I didn't have a single Lexus in my driveway. By page 50, my thumbprints were smudging the paper. Heavy grease and copper dust were ground deep into my fingernails, stark proof of where my money had actually gone. Every single cent on those pages was earned while I was suspended 80 feet off the ground on power poles, earned while breathing in storm ozone, earned while wearing out my rotator cuff and enduring constant back pain. I did the math the way a blue-collar guy does, plain and simple. 14 months of hard labor, including double-time storm pay, meant roughly $130,000 in net income, and the account showed $314 left. Someone had drained me dry. A knock on the window pulled me back to reality. My old work partner, Mike, was standing there, his weathered face filled with concern. There were 40 minutes left before shift start. I rolled down the window. He asked me if I was doing all right. It felt like a question with no real answer. I had just found out someone was draining my hard-earned money. Someone who had full access to my account. Someone who knew exactly how much I made and when I got paid. I told him I wasn't entirely sure yet. He asked if I needed any help. I needed time to think. Time to figure out who was draining my money. Time to decide how to handle 53 pages of undeniable proof showing I had been living a complete lie. I told him I just needed a moment to myself. He nodded, knowing the unspoken understanding between guys in high-risk jobs. Sometimes you just need space to process things. I sat in that truck for nearly 2 hours, staring at every page, hoping the numbers would somehow magically rearrange themselves into a logical explanation. But they didn't. The morning sun rose higher, warming the cab, yet I felt chilled to the bone. By the time I finally turned the key in the ignition, something fundamental inside me had shifted forever. It wasn't rage yet. Rage would come later. This was colder, far more permanent. A resolve was taking shape in my chest, compacting over time like coal under pressure. The engine roared, and as I pulled out of the lot, I knew with complete clarity that I was no longer the same man who had parked there 2 hours ago. Wednesday morning, long before sunrise, I was back at the credit union. As I pulled into a spot, David was just unlocking the front door. He recognized my truck and waited by the entrance. He commented on how early I was arriving before my shift. I told him I had some business to take care of before heading to the job site. He led me inside the building, which was still holding the chill of the night. The lamp on his desk clicked on. I stayed standing, holding my thermos tight in one hand. I told him I needed to open a new account, a personal one, under my name only. His fingers paused over the keyboard for a brief second. In that fleeting moment, I saw a look of understanding cross his face. He'd worked in banking long enough to know the sound of a man drawing a hard line. He asked if I wanted a checking or savings account. I requested a checking account, adding that I needed my paychecks direct deposited into this new account moving forward. He said he could handle that and asked for 20 minutes to get the paperwork ready. While he typed and printed the forms, I sat down and signed everywhere indicated. Arthur Vance, individual account. The pen felt infinitely heavier than usual. Every signature felt like a quiet act of taking back control. When we finished, he slid a temporary debit card across the desk, explaining that my official card would arrive in 7 to 10 business days, and the direct deposit change would take effect next pay cycle. I noted that meant this coming Friday. He confirmed it was Friday. He looked at me, a deep look where professional courtesy gave way to pure human empathy, and asked if everything was going to be okay. I told him it would be very soon. Line work that day felt entirely different. The same danger, the same heights, the same crew. But I completed every movement in complete silence, speaking only when strictly necessary. Mike was the first to notice. He asked if I was okay, noting how quiet I was being. I told him I was just staying focused. But it wasn't focus. It was calculation. Every line I connected, every bolt I torqued, I was doing the math in my head. 3 days until Friday. 3 days until my check hit the new account. 3 days until Eleanor checked that joint account and found it completely empty. The anticipation built inside me like a slow-burning fuse, steady and impossible to stop. At lunch on Thursday, Mike found me sitting alone on the hood of the work truck, chewing my sandwich like it was cardboard. He came over and leaned beside me. He noted that I had a lot on my mind. I took a bite, chewed, and swallowed. The cold November air smelled of diesel and dried grass. I told him I was just handling some things, mainly money troubles. That statement hit closer to home than he knew. Mike and I had been working the power grid together for nearly 30 years. There was a deep level of honesty between us. I added that it wasn't so much trouble, but more like finally seeing reality clearly. He nodded slowly and told me to let him know if I ever needed anything. I told him I appreciated it. Friday morning arrived right on schedule, frost coating the windshield, my spine stiff as steel. During our first break, I pulled out my phone and opened the new banking app. A notification sat there, clean and simple. Direct deposit received. $9,800, including double-time storm pay. First Credit Union of Texas, personal checking. Then, I opened the old joint account app. The screen loaded, revealing bold numbers, $0.00. I put my phone away and went back to work, feeling something heavy uncoil in my chest. It wasn't quite relief, but more like putting down a weight you've carried so long you forgot how heavy it was. Shift change brought the usual exhaustion. I showered in the locker room at the yard, watching the mud and grease wash down the drain, putting on clean clothes. The reflection in the spotted mirror showed a man who looked the same as yesterday on the outside, but inside, everything was completely different, never to be the same again. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than usual, every familiar landmark acting like a countdown. Rosie's Diner, where Eleanor and I used to grab Sunday breakfast. The turnoff to Horseshoe Lake, where I hadn't gone fishing in over a year. The struggling shops and empty storefronts along Main Street. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white from pressure. The dashboard clock glowed in the fading dusk. 6:15 p.m. Eleanor was definitely home. My stepson, Julian, too. By now, both of them had undoubtedly tried to use their cards. Tried and failed. Unwanted thoughts kept rushing in. A mental list of all the sacrifices I had silently made without ever being asked. 30 years of breathing toxic air, enduring high-voltage electromagnetic fields and torn muscles. Hearing loss from roaring heavy machinery. Scars on my hands from snapped steel cables. A spine that hadn't been fully straight in a decade. For what? So my could go to high-end med spas. So her son could wire money to a woman I'd never even met. I turned down my road, the oak trees standing bare under a purple sky. My ranch sat at the end of the lane. A property with a home I bought 30 years ago, completely paid off a decade back. Now Eleanor lived in it. Julian lived in it, and I felt like a stranger in my own house. Both of their vehicles were parked in the wide driveway. Eleanor's brand new Mercedes SUV was gleaming under the porch light. Julian's Lexus was parked crooked beside it. No movement in the windows, no light from the TV, just a still, waiting darkness. After shutting off the engine, I sat in the truck, letting the silence wrap around me. 30 seconds passed, a minute. Far off, a dog barked, breaking the quiet. A normal rural night sound. But inside my chest, something ancient and unshakable was taking hold. I got out, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. 3 steps to the flagstone walk, 6 steps up the porch stairs. My hand touched the doorknob, feeling solid and freezing cold under my palm. The house held its breath on the other side. I turned the key and pushed the door open. Eleanor was standing in the middle of the living room, arms crossed tight over her chest, fingers digging into her elbows so hard the skin was white. Julian was pacing beside her like a trapped animal, gripping his phone tightly as if he were about to crush it. The TV was pitch black. No music, nothing except the sound of my boots stepping over the threshold and their short, shallow breaths. They turned toward me at the exact same time, and I saw it in their eyes. They knew. Not everything, not yet, but they knew something fundamental had shifted, and they were terrified. Good. My heavy metal lunchbox hit the entryway table with a loud ringing thud that echoed through the house. I didn't look up, didn't need to. I could feel them staring at me from the living room. Eleanor sat on the edge of the sofa. Julian stood beside her, both wound tight as springs. I took off my dark blue utility company jacket and hung it on the hook by the door. The fabric was stiff with dried sweat and gear oil. My hands were stained dark all the way to the wrists, and my jeans were caked with heavy mud at the cuffs. I had just put in 14 hours of brutal physical labor in harsh weather, smelling strongly of engine grease, sweat, and wet earth. Eleanor stood up. Her cashmere sweater was spotless, her pants pressed without a single wrinkle. Her makeup was flawless, her lips painted a carefully chosen shade of rose. Julian had clearly just showered. I could smell his expensive cologne from halfway across the room. His hair was slicked back, wearing brand-name streetwear that probably cost more than my monthly food budget. Behind them, the living room looked like a high-end furniture showroom. A $3,000 espresso machine sat in the corner of the open kitchen, something I remembered seeing on a credit card statement once. Imported Italian leather armchairs rested against the wall. A massive 85-inch flat-screen TV hung above the fireplace like a shrine. Scattered across the coffee table were various fancy packaging boxes from brands I couldn't even name. Eleanor's voice sliced through the silence, demanding to know what I had done to the joint account, her hands trembling. She shouted that she felt like an idiot standing at the register, asking if I was trying to cut her and her son off from their livelihood. Julian stepped forward, shoving his phone toward my face. The screen showed the banking app with bold numbers, displaying a zero balance. He yelled in a high-pitched, accusing tone, asking where the money went. I walked right past them into the kitchen, filled a glass with water from the tap, and took a slow drink. The refrigerator hummed, and the wall clock ticked steadily in the quiet. I remembered the day I agreed to open that joint account. Eleanor sat right at this kitchen table, placing her hand over mine, telling me we were a family now, and family shares everything. I believed her. I thought that's just what you do when you love someone. I told them I opened a new card. Eleanor turned pale, asking what I meant by a new card and a new account. I set the water glass down carefully and told her my paychecks were going there now. The silence that followed was like the moment right before a utility tower collapses, when you hear the steel frame groan and you know you only have seconds to clear out. 5 seconds, the clock ticking, the fridge compressor kicking on. Then came the explosion. She screamed that it was a joint account, that we had an agreement, and that I promised we would share everything. I told her I knew, but I didn't see it that way anymore. Julian started shouting, asking what I was talking about and telling me I couldn't just do that. I looked at him, then back at Eleanor, and said I could, because I just did. Eleanor took a step closer, her voice dropping down into a dangerous register, telling me they had bills to pay and a social circle to maintain, saying I couldn't just cut off their living expenses. I told her I had been paying for their lives all along, that for 14 months I covered every single expense, because they claim that's what family does. Eleanor clenched her hands into tight fists at her sides, yelling that this was what marriage was supposed to be about. I almost laughed out loud, truly almost did. Instead of laughing, I walked over to the window. The wide driveway outside was neat and orderly. Eleanor's silver Mercedes, spotless, less than 3 years old, showing barely 16,000 miles on the odometer. Last time I checked, she drove less than 5,000 miles a year. Julian's dark red Lexus, under 2 years old, sitting at 11,000 miles. Both cars parked neatly in the garage, waxed and serviced regularly. My Ford pickup was parked right behind them, 280,000 miles, rust creeping along the wheel wells. A dent in the tailgate from 6 years ago when I backed into a loading dock. The leather on the driver's seat held together with duct tape. I looked out the window and told her if she wanted to talk about family, we could talk tomorrow. Eleanor's voice turned sharp, refusing to wait until tomorrow and demanding we settle it right now. I turned around to face her, reminding her I had to be on the job site by 5 in the morning, having just worked 14 hours at extreme heights, and told her I was going to sleep. She tried to warn me, saying she was laying down the law. I looked at her, then over at Julian, telling them we would talk tomorrow, once I laid out every single number right in front of them. Julian stood there, mouth agape, unable to utter a single word. Eleanor stared at me with wide eyes, searching my face for something, maybe fear, maybe guilt, but she found nothing. I turned toward the stairs. My boots landed heavy on the hardwood floor, every single step planted firm and solid. My shoulders were still aching from lugging heavy glass insulators all afternoon, and my knees protested with every stair I climbed. When I reached the bottom step, I paused for a second and rested one hand on the banister. I reminded them about the numbers, telling them I'd see them tomorrow. Then I went upstairs, walked into the bedroom, and pulled the door shut behind me. The latch caught with a soft, clean click. Downstairs, I could hear their voices starting right back up. Eleanor's voice was sharp and panicked, while Julian's was higher, choked with anger. I sat on the edge of the mattress, unlaced my boots, and set them side by side on the floor. The muffled noise from downstairs faded into background hum, no different than the buzz of a substation transformer. I laid back and stared up at the ceiling. Tomorrow I was going to show them all 53 pages. Tomorrow they were going to see the numbers with their own eyes. Tomorrow they would finally understand. Tomorrow I will open that 53-page folder and walk them through every single number. But before I reveal the total amount that vanished over those 14 months, drop a comment below with your guess. Was it $50,000, $100,000, or even more? Leave your guess so I know you're following along. Just a quick heads up, the story from here on includes fictionalized elements added for perspective. If any of it makes you uncomfortable, feel free to step away at any time. They didn't let me get a peaceful night's sleep. Around 8 o'clock, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I was lying on top of the covers, fully clothed, still wearing my jeans and flannel shirt, staring at a water stain on the drywall. The shouting downstairs had stopped about half an hour earlier. I heard a door slam, probably Julian's room, and then nothing but the quiet creaking of the house itself. The knock on my door was soft, almost hesitant. Eleanor's voice came through the paneling, muffled and quiet, asking if we could please talk. I sat up and switched on the bedside lamp, telling her okay. When I opened the door, they were both standing there in the hallway. Eleanor's makeup was smudged beneath her eyes. Julian had his arms crossed tight, his jaw set hard. Eleanor's voice trembled as she told me I couldn't just handle things this way, saying we needed to discuss this like mature adults. I told them fine, to go downstairs to the kitchen. We took our seats around the kitchen table like opponents at a negotiation. Eleanor and Julian sat on one side, and I sat on the other. The overhead fluorescent tube buzzed with a harsh, cold current. Eleanor spoke up first, telling me that if I had an issue with how she managed the money, I should have just said something directly instead of pulling a surprise move like this. I told her I actually did say something. many times, reminding her that she always told me not to worry because she was taking care of it. Her voice still raised a notch as she asked if I thought maintaining our standard of living in this house was free. I told her no, but I figured it should cost a lot less than the small fortune that went missing. I stood up and said I'd be right back. Outside, the November night was freezing and silent, my breath blooming into thick white clouds as I walked across the driveway toward my pickup. I pulled open the passenger door and reached under the seat for the heavy brown paper folder. 53 pages were printed on standard white paper, folded down the middle. When I walked back into the kitchen, Eleanor and Julian were whispering back and forth nervously. The second they saw me, they went dead silent. I dropped the folder onto the table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that rattled the wood. I told them here were 14 months of bank statements, running from last August through October, and asked if they wanted to go through them with me. Eleanor stared at the folder like it was a wild animal about to bite her, saying she didn't need to review her own transaction history. I told her I'd just highlight a few key items then. I opened the folder, pulled out the top sheet, and slid it across the table. I pointed out October 12th, annual country club dues, $2,400. I pulled another page out. October 19th, online order at Neiman Marcus, $3,100. Another page. October 22nd, direct mobile transfer to Chloe Davis, $800. Julian's face went dead white in an instant. I didn't stop. I kept pulling page after page, laying them out side by side across the table. January 15th, Tulum Beach Resort, $8,500. First-class airfare for $3,200, luxury suite accommodations. Eleanor's voice went raspy as she interjected, claiming that was a wellness trip meant for stress relief, and that they needed that getaway. I reminded her that during that exact week, I was working double shifts every single day repairing power grids wrecked by a tornado, and that she had told me the money was going toward fixing the roof on the farm barn. I kept going, pulling more sheets. February 3rd, high-end med spa, $1,200. February 17th, med spa, $1,200. March 3rd, med spa, $1,200. I tapped my knuckle against the paper, pointing out that in 3 short months, $3,600 went into cosmetic injections. I looked at Eleanor and told her that today, when I tried to buy a $280 safety harness to keep me alive high up on the towers, my card got declined. Julian tried to derail the conversation, telling me I was taking things out of context and ignoring normal living expenses like groceries. I pulled out another sheet, pointing to Whole Foods market entries averaging $800 a week. I did the math out loud, $3,200 a month for 3 people, noting that before they moved in, my monthly food bill was barely $500. I slid a stack of pages highlighted in bright yellow toward him. I pointed out those were the transfers to Chloe Davis, 22 separate transactions over 6 months. I read the numbers right off the page. $800, $1,200, $2,000, $1,500, totaling $28,000. I looked him dead in the eye and asked who Chloe was. Julian set his jaw tight, claiming that was his personal business. I told him the second he used my money, it became my business. Eleanor turned to him, demanding to know who Chloe actually was. Julian snapped that she was his fiancée, claiming she needed help paying rent on a high-end apartment or she'd have nowhere to live. I kept my voice completely steady as I questioned helping with rent, pointing out that 3 of those transfers were time-stamped between 2 and 4 in the morning, asking what kind of rent payment happens at that hour. I pulled out the final page. It was a single sheet covered in my own neat handwriting, numbers arranged in straight columns. I read off the totals. Total deposited over 14 months was $130,000. Current balance sat at $314.20. Total spent came out to $129,685.80. I broke it down for them. Julian's supposed tech startup investment turned out to be $18,000 in crypto losses. Transfers to Chloe, $28,000. Luxury retail, designer clothes and cosmetic spas, $39,000. Upscale dining and private clubs, $15,000. Luxury trips to Mexico and other travel expenses, $29,000. I told them I spent 3,600 hours working high up on the power grid, meaning the physical wear and tear on my body came out to $36 an hour. I slid that paper right into the middle of the table. I told them every single penny they spent was earned while I was suspended dozens of feet in the air, through storms and lightning, inhaling ozone, damaging my lungs and joints, and risking high-voltage electrocution. I said that was what my sacrifice paid for. Resort vacations I was never invited on, a fiancé I didn't even know existed, and expensive cosmetic treatments while I was working overtime. Eleanor began to cry, complaining that I was making her sound like a monster. I told her I was just reading the numbers off the page, and if those numbers made her sound like a monster, I wasn't the one who created it out of thin air. Julian slammed his hands down and stood up, furious, declaring the whole thing ridiculous and arguing that parents have a duty to support their child's future. I told him he was 24 years old, and he wasn't my son. Dead silence filled the room. I reminded him he was Eleanor's son, and while I welcomed him into my house, that didn't make me a walk-up cash machine. Eleanor made a desperate attempt to patch things over, admitting they made mistakes and spent too much, but insisted we could fix it by getting jobs and paying the money back. I pointed out that she already had a job working part-time at the gallery in town and asked where her paychecks were going. She went completely silent. I answered for her, noting they went into her personal checking account, the one I had zero access to. I remarked on how interesting that was. Eleanor's hands shook as she gathered the papers together, almost like hiding them would somehow erase reality. Julian stormed off upstairs. The kitchen fell into an absolute dead quiet, broken only by the steady hum of the refrigerator, a fridge I had paid for in full 6 years ago. I decided I'd tell them what was going to happen next tomorrow. Tonight, I was letting the numbers speak for themselves. By Saturday morning, frost was thick on the window panes, but my mind was entirely clear. I got up at 6, took a shower, and put on clean clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt that didn't smell like rubber or sweat. Downstairs, I brewed a pot of coffee using a bag of beans I had bought 3 days ago with the last of my cash, hidden deep in the back cabinet. By 7:30, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming mug in front of me, a blank notebook, and a pen. The tabletop was completely clear. Those 53 pages were gone. Eleanor must have taken them upstairs. In their place, a single blank sheet of paper lay waiting. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Eleanor came down first, and Julian followed a few minutes later. Both of them looked rough, no makeup, messy hair, eyes red from crying or arguing. Eleanor stopped at the foot of the stairs, asking if we could talk about this like sensible adults. I told her that was the exact reason I was sitting there. They took their seats across from me in the same spots as last night. Eleanor folded her hands neatly on the table. She acknowledged that last night was overwhelming, but insisted that we were a family and could get through it together. I told her we could, but only under brand new terms. Her face went rigid as she repeated the word terms. I told her yes, because the way things were running before simply wasn't going to work anymore. I picked up the pen and began writing as I spoke, noting that the situation was actually worse than the $129,000. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper as she asked what I meant. I asked her how much credit card debt there was. She hesitated. I clarified that I wasn't asking as her husband, but as the guy whose name might be printed on those accounts. She answered in a tiny voice, saying it was roughly $35,000. I didn't react visibly, I just wrote the number down on the page. Drained joint account, nearly $130,000. Credit card debt, $35,000. Total financial hit, $165,000. Julian's voice rose as he claimed they never intended for things to get that bad. I told him good intentions don't change the facts and kept writing. Then, I turned the notebook around to face them. I laid out their choices plainly. Option 1, they stay. But if they stay, they sign a postnuptial agreement waiving any future claim to my farm property. They pay $1,500 a month in rent, which covers utilities, buy their own groceries, stay completely out of my accounts, and pay off their own debts. Julian gets a labor job on a farm or finds a real job to pay off what he owes. I gave them 14 days to make up their minds. I paused for a second and told them to think it through carefully. Then I laid out option 2. They leave. They find their own place, handle their own finances, and get zero support from me moving forward. I tapped my pen against the paper, pointing out that today was day 1 and the clock was officially ticking. Julian exploded, yelling about paying rent in his own house and asking what kind of property agreement I was talking about. I told him calmly that it was my house, paid off a full decade before I ever met his mother. He argued that they lived there and it was their home. I told him no, they were guests who had overstayed their welcome. Eleanor tried taking a different angle, telling me I couldn't charge my own wife rent or force her to sign an agreement, claiming that wasn't how marriage works. I told her she was right, noting that in a real marriage, one person doesn't quietly siphon $130,000 from the other and rack up over $30,000 in hidden debt without saying a word. She flinched backward. I kept my tone completely steady, pointing out that $1,500 was actually way below market value. Renting a decent 2-bedroom apartment in Amarillo costs $2,000 a month plus utilities and deposits. I was offering them below market rent on a fully paid-off farm with a yard. I made it clear that wasn't cruelty, it was a business arrangement. Eleanor's voice cracked as she accused me of treating them like tenants. I told her I was treating them like adults who needed to take accountability. Julian turned to Eleanor, asking if they could even afford $1,500. Eleanor looked panicked, saying she only brought in $1,200 a month from the gallery. I told her that meant Julian needed to pitch in, or they both needed to pick up extra work, or they could choose option 2. A memory flashed into my mind unbidden, sharp and clear. My father, another blue-collar guy, who worked heavy physical labor, dying at 58 from complications brought on by years of overwork. Our very last conversation took place in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and quiet defeat. He told me back then that family means supporting one another, but there's a world of difference between holding someone up and letting them bleed you dry. He told me never to let anyone mistake my kindness for weakness. I blinked, pulling myself back to the present moment. I told them I had spent my whole life carrying heavy loads, lugging heavy glass insulators and thick steel cables on power towers, carrying the responsibility of making sure my crew made it home safe every night. I admitted I thought supporting a family would feel different and lighter, but it didn't. I told them they never treated me like family, but rather like a resource to be mined. Eleanor started weeping, saying it wasn't fair and pointing out that she cooked and cleaned. I asked her when was the last time she cooked a meal that wasn't takeout paid for with my money. She had no answer for that. I pushed the notebook clear across the table, reminding them they had 14 days, 2 full weeks. If they paid, they could stay. If they couldn't, they had to pack up and go. The free ride was officially over. Today was day 1, and the clock was ticking. Julian grabbed his phone and rushed upstairs, yelling that this was insane and he was calling Aunt Martha. I didn't bother stopping him. Eleanor stayed seated, staring down at the notebook like she expected the written words to magically rewrite themselves if she looked long enough. She asked if I was truly going through with this. I told her yes. She asked what would happen if they couldn't make a decision within 14 days. I told her I'd make the decision for them. Eleanor picked up the notebook and walked upstairs like she was carrying a sentence. Maybe it was one. I poured myself another cup of coffee, bought with my own money, in my own house, on my own terms. For the first time in 14 months, the coffee tasted entirely different. It didn't taste bitter at all. It tasted like freedom. The first 3 days felt like living with polite strangers who were quietly plotting something. Day 3 was a Monday. I was in the kitchen making breakfast, eggs and toast, plain and simple. Julian actually came downstairs, which was rare for him since he usually slept until 10 in the morning. He had even shaved and put on regular casual clothes instead of his usual baggy pajamas. The effort was painfully obvious. I cracked the eggs into the skillet, listening to them sizzle. After 30 years of making breakfast before dawn shifts, my hands ran on pure autopilot. He offered a cheerful morning, old man, his tone way too upbeat. I gave him a simple morning back. He leaned against the counter, trying to play it casual, suggesting that maybe things just got off on the wrong foot on Friday. I flipped the eggs with my spatula, watching the whites set, telling him we didn't get off on the wrong foot, but rather had just been walking in the wrong direction for way too long. He tried reading my face, but didn't find a thing. He mentioned that he could go out and get a job, claiming he was planning on it anyway. I told him that sounded sensible. He asked if I could reconsider the rent and the agreement terms then. I gave him a single-word answer. No, that closed the door completely. He stood there frozen for a second, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. Then he turned around and headed back upstairs. I heard his bedroom door shut tight, not quite a slam, but close enough. Day 4 was a Tuesday. I got home around 6:30 in the evening to an unexpected smell filling the house. The smell of actual cooking, real food. Eleanor was in the kitchen actually preparing dinner. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, everything I used to enjoy eating. The table was completely set. Plates, silverware cloth napkins I didn't even know we owned. A candle sat right in the center, unlit but ready to go. When she saw me walk in, she smiled, a look that felt like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. She said she made dinner with all my favorites, suggesting we sit down and eat together like a real family. For half a second, I almost said yes. Almost sat right down. The food smelled incredible, and no one had cooked a real meal in this house for months. Then those 53 bank pages flashed in my mind. I told her I already ate, a complete lie, because I hadn't. She protested that she had cooked so much food. I told her I was heading out to the garage workshop. I walked right past the home-cooked food, right past the set table, right past her carefully staged illusion of normalcy. I stepped out the back door, went to the workshop, and ate a peanut butter and jelly sandwich whilst listening to classic rock on the radio. Lynyrd Skynyrd was playing Simple Man. That simple sandwich tasted better than any pot roast ever could. Day 5 was a Wednesday, and Eleanor tried a financial angle. I was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the classifieds in the paper out of pure curiosity, checking apartment listings to see what $2,000 a month could rent in Amarillo. Turns out, not much. Eleanor walked in dressed neatly in a blouse, slacks, and low heels, job interview attire. She announced that she had submitted resumes for full-time positions and had an interview lined up with the school district. I kept my eyes on the paper, noting that it was good to see effort being made and responsibility being taken. She sat down across from me and folded her hands neat, like we were in a business meeting, asking if we could adjust the timeline, claiming 14 days was way too rushed. I told her 2 weeks was plenty of time to make a choice. She started to protest again. I looked up from the paper and stared straight into her eyes, telling her the terms were completely non-negotiable. She opened her mouth, closed it, got up, and walked out of the room. Day 6 was a Thursday, a routine maintenance break, after the storm work wrapped up. The break area by the bucket trucks was crowded, heavy with the smell of sweat and stale coffee, while the hum of transformers echoed overhead. Mike and I sat together on a metal bench, eating in silence for a while, sandwiches and lukewarm coffee. Mike broke the quiet, mentioning he'd heard talk around town that things had been pretty lively at my place, noting how small towns are for gossip, and asking if I was holding up all right. I told him I was doing better than I had been in months. Mike nodded real slow, took a sip of his coffee, and grimaced a bit. He said that was good and told me I was doing the right thing. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewed, swallowed, and stared at the concrete wall for a moment. He shared that his ex-wife had pulled something similar years ago. Not as much money, maybe 15 grand, but the exact same playbook, making him feel guilty and small just for caring about his own hard-earned money. I asked him how he got through it. He told me he simply stopped apologizing for having self-respect. I nodded, slow and meaningful, engraving those words right into my mind. You made the right call, Mike added. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Day 7, Friday night. My tolerance for the shared space had officially hit its absolute limit. I pulled open the refrigerator. Cold air rushed out, bathed in the sharp glare of the bright interior light. The shelves were a chaotic disaster, half-empty containers, scattered condiment bottles, and things I didn't even recognize. The leftovers from the Chinese food I bought on Wednesday were completely gone. My milk was down to half a carton, even though it was 3/4 full this morning. My package of deli turkey was torn open, with half the slices missing. I stood there with the fridge door wide open. The cold air pooled over my work boots while the compressor hummed away. The harsh light made the whole mess look cold and depressing. I made a decision right then and there. I walked out to the garage workshop, dug through my toolbox, and pulled out a roll of masking tape and a black Sharpie. I walked back into the kitchen, tore off a strip of tape, and wrote in block letters, Arthur's, do not touch. I slapped a label on everything that belonged to me. The milk carton, the eggs with half a dozen left, the deli turkey, the 2 slices of leftover pizza wrapped in aluminum foil, the orange juice, even the butter, because why not? I pressed every single label down flat, making them bold, obvious, and undeniable. Julian walked downstairs just as I was smoothing down the last one, fresh out of the shower with his hair still dripping wet. He asked what on earth I was doing. I told him I was labeling my food, without even pausing my hands. He scoffed that it was completely unhinged, asking who labels food in their own house. I told him someone who is dead tired of watching the food they buy magically disappear. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture, the shutter sound ringing out sharp in the quiet kitchen. He declared that it was insane, adding that people needed to see this. I told him to suit himself. Late that night, he posted that picture on social media. I didn't see it personally, but Eleanor told me about it the next morning, her voice tight with deep embarrassment. The caption said something about me acting like a paranoid guard over groceries, tagged with toxic family drama and some emoji I didn't care to understand. He expected a wave of sympathy. Instead, the comment section completely blew up in his face. People commented that he was 24 and should buy his own food. Others pointed out that it sounded like he was always eating my stuff without asking, or that I was simply setting basic boundaries. They asked if respecting other people's property was really that hard, noted that I was just protecting what was mine out of self-respect, and said if their adult kid ate their food without asking, they'd do the exact same thing. One comment summed it up directly, telling him that in this story, he was the problem, not me. Julian deleted the post within 2 hours. Over that weekend, I noticed even more quiet whispering. Conversations that cut off the second I walked into a room. Eleanor made 3 hushed phone calls behind closed doors. I heard her urgent, low tone through the bedroom wall, though I couldn't catch the exact words. Once I heard her say, Martha, followed by please, and he's just not listening. By Monday morning, reinforcements were set to arrive. I didn't know it yet, but the diplomatic phase was officially over. They had called in someone who was convinced she could break my resolve. Day 8, trouble pulled right into my driveway in the form of a Range Rover. I got home after my shift at 5:45 in the afternoon, still carrying the smell of static and engine grease. The vehicle sat there gleaming, a brand new 2022 luxury model. I recognized the car immediately. Martha Hayes, Eleanor's sister, a high-end real estate agent from Dallas. I'd met her twice before, once at our wedding and once 2 years ago during Thanksgiving. Both times she looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd tracked in on her shoes. The reinforcements had arrived. I sat in my pickup for a solid minute, listening to the hot engine tick as it cooled down, steadying myself for what was waiting inside. When I walked through the door, the 3 of them were lined up in the living room like they'd rehearsed the position. Martha was sitting in my reading chair, the one by the window that I'd used for 15 years. Eleanor sat on the sofa, and Julian leered from the armrest with a smug, fake smile plastered on his face. Martha stood up the second I walked in, formal and deliberate. She told me we needed to talk. I set my lunchbox down on the entryway table and noted that I wasn't expecting to see her. She claimed she came the moment she heard what was happening, saying her sister called her in tears and she had to be there. I stayed standing near the doorway, refusing to sit down or let them surround me. She told me Eleanor informed her I was making some unilateral decisions regarding finances. I told her I was making decisions regarding my finances. Martha adjusted her designer glasses and looked me up and down, taking in the stains on my work jacket, the grease under my fingernails, and the faint scuffs my work boots left on the hardwood floor. She insisted that Eleanor was my wife, that Texas was a community property state, and that joint property meant both sides had a say, claiming that wasn't what was happening here. She then brought up Eleanor's ex-husband, calling him a real provider who never questioned what his wife needed or made her feel small for spending money. She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Of course, he was a regional corporate executive, not a guy who did heavy physical labor. The insult was aimed straight at me, trying to equate line work with being a lesser man and blue-collar work with being unworthy. My jaw tightened, but I kept my mouth shut. Martha continued, her voice smooth as silk over broken glass, suggesting that maybe I didn't understand how families of a certain class operated, claiming women have needs and social obligations to maintain, and that appearances mattered. I asked her if she meant working 30 years on high-voltage lines, just so my wife could go to luxury spas, and her son could lease a high-end apartment for some girlfriend, telling her to cut the act. Martha waved her hand dismissively, claiming Eleanor deserved a few modest luxuries, asserting that $130,000 wasn't even that large a sum. She insisted numbers could be manipulated and claimed she was sure things weren't nearly as bad as I made them out to be. Eleanor chimed in with a line that was clearly rehearsed, suggesting that now that her sister was here, maybe we could all sit down calmly. I told her no. Martha's eyebrows shot up as she asked my pardon. I told her no, that I refused to negotiate, and that the terms stood as they were. Martha sneered, cold and sharp, calling me unreasonable and stubborn, just like Eleanor had said. I told her that was her opinion, walked right past them, headed upstairs to my bedroom, and shut the door. The following night, Tuesday, I stayed out late in the workshop to avoid going inside. The Texas November night was unusually humid, so I cracked the workshop window open an inch. That's when I heard their voices floating out from the house. The kitchen window was open too. Martha and Eleanor were talking, completely unaware that I could hear every single word. Martha's voice came through crisp and authoritative, telling Eleanor to listen carefully, claiming men like me were control freaks who used money to exert power. Eleanor pointed out that I laid out all the statements and that everything was plain to see. Martha told her that didn't matter, instructing her to never let me see another bill, to separate her cards, and to just tell me she handled it if I asked. She added that men get emotional when they see numbers, sharing that her ex-husband never knew how much she lost at the casinos because what he didn't know couldn't hurt him. Eleanor hesitated, starting to object. Martha cut her off, insisting that was how you survived a marriage, by controlling the flow of information. I froze in the workshop, listening to every word. I felt a wave of disappointment, but no real surprise. So that's where Eleanor learned those tactics. Day 10, Wednesday. They tried to stage a full intervention. I came home, and the three of them were waiting for me again. Martha opened up, telling me to sit down so we could resolve things today. I told her there was nothing to resolve, reminding them they had 4 days left to make a choice. Martha argued that the whole idea of charging rent and signing agreements was absurd, saying Eleanor was my wife, and wives don't pay rent. I told her wives don't steal money either. Martha took a sharp breath, demanding to know how I dared call her sister a thief. I asked her what else she would call quietly taking $130,000 without permission and hiding over $30,000 in credit card debt, asking if she called that a marriage, because I called it a financial scam. I looked over at Eleanor, asking if that was what she thought marriage meant, that I risk my life while they spend without limits. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I turned back to Martha, telling her she was welcome as a guest, but she had zero say in my house. Martha's voice pitched up as she reminded me that Eleanor lived there, claiming that made her half owner of the house in a community property state. I stared her down, telling her my name was the only one on the deed, that the property was paid off a decade before I married her sister, making it separate personal property. I made it crystal clear. It was my house. Martha turned toward Eleanor and whispered loud enough for me to hear on purpose, saying she told her I was a control freak and that guys like me always played that card. I walked straight out of the house and back to the workshop. I spent the rest of the night installing a solid deadbolt on the inside of my bedroom door. Boundaries officially needed a physical lock now. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Eleanor's ex-husband, who passed away 5 years ago. Eleanor mentioned once that he was under immense stress toward the end, dying of a sudden heart attack at 62, only 4 years older than I was now. I wondered if he ever knew about Martha's so-called casino debts or things like it. I wondered if the silent stress of being kept in the dark contributed to his passing. I refused to spend the rest of my life living in suspicion. I knew the exact numbers now, and that clarity might just save my life. Day 11, 80 feet in the air. That was when my body decided to remind me it wasn't made of forged steel. It was 10:30 in the morning. We were working an emergency repair on a 345 kilovolt transmission line wrecked by high winds. The gusts were heavy, making the bucket sway up in the air. The protective suit was thick and heavy. I'd been in this trade for 30 years, same repetitive motions, same risks, with the constant noise of howling wind and distant generators. Then a sudden tightness gripped my chest. It wasn't a sharp, stabbing pain, but a heavy pressure, like someone put my ribs in a vise and started cranking the handle. My left arm went completely numb. I couldn't catch my breath, which is deadly when you're working at that altitude. The edges of my vision started to blur. My mind immediately jumped to one conclusion: a heart attack, just like Eleanor's ex-husband. I was 58, carrying a buildup of severe fatigue. This was it. My hands slipped right off the high-voltage clamp. Mike was working nearby in another bucket and caught it instantly, shouting my name out loud. I leaned against the edge of the bucket, gripping my chest, breathing in short, shallow gasps. Mike grabbed his radio, calling down to the ground crew, telling them he needed an ambulance at Section 7 for a man down. They lowered my bucket to the ground. Mike and another crewmate practically carried me over to the shade. My head was spinning, my heart pounding out of control. The site paramedic was already waiting with his emergency kit. He asked where it hurt. I managed to say my chest and left arm, and that I couldn't breathe. He wrapped the cuff around my arm, pumped it up, and watched the gauge, noting my blood pressure was at 180 over 115, dangerously high. He clipped the pulse oximeter onto my finger, checking my oxygen at 95%, calling it acceptable for the elevation. He checked my heart rate, noting it was at 118 beats per minute, confirming tachycardia, and asked if there was a family history of heart trouble. I told him my father passed away at 58 from work-related complications. He stated they needed to get me to the ER immediately. Mike followed the ambulance in the company truck. I didn't argue. The chest tightness eased a bit, but the fear didn't leave. The ER was bathed in bright fluorescent lights and smelled of disinfectant. They wheeled me straight into a back room. The nurses hooked me up to monitors. Wires everywhere, machines beeped steadily. The doctor was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair tied back and reading glasses resting on her chest. Her badge read Dr. Reynolds. She informed me they were going to run an EKG, check my blood for troponin to look for heart damage, and keep me under observation for a few hours. I asked how long that would take. She replied 3 hours at minimum, longer if anything abnormal showed up. The EKG took 10 minutes with 12 leads attached across my chest. The machine printed out a long strip of paper covered in jagged lines. They drew 2 tubes of blood, and then we waited. Mike sat in the chair beside my bed, telling me he called the yard and let them know I was taking the rest of the week off. I told him I didn't need a whole week off. Mike insisted it was doctor's orders, reminding me I heard what she said. 3 hours passed before Dr. Reynolds came back holding a clipboard. She reported that my EKG came back normal and my troponin levels were negative, showing no signs of a heart attack. A massive wave of relief washed over me. However, she continued, explaining that my blood pressure was dangerously high. 180/115 fell right into a hypertensive crisis. She noted that my stress response was sky high, and the symptoms I experienced were consistent with a severe panic attack. I told her I'd never had a panic attack in my life. Mike chimed in quietly from the chair, muttering that I'd never had someone drain over 6 figures from my bank account before either. Dr. Reynolds looked at me over her glasses, explaining that panic attack symptoms mimic a heart attack almost perfectly: chest pain, arm numbness, shortness of breath. She told me my body was screaming at me, emphasizing that at 58, given my physical job and family history, they took it very seriously. She wrote on her prescription pad, explaining she was prescribing blood pressure medication to take daily, along with a referral to see a cardiologist within 2 weeks for a stress test. She explicitly ordered me to take at least 2 full days off, stating my body needed rest. I asked what I should do if it happened again. She instructed that if it happened again, I was to call 911 immediately, without waiting or trying to drive myself. She paused at the door, adding that whatever was causing that level of stress in my life, I had to resolve it, because next time it might not be anxiety, it might be a real heart attack. Mike drove me home around 6 in the evening as the sun was setting. When I walked through the door, Julian was sitting in the living room. He looked up, caught sight of my face, and froze. I must have looked terrible, pale, sunken eyes, with the hospital band still wrapped around my wrist. His tone shifted completely as he asked what happened and where I'd been. I told him I was at the hospital, but that I was okay. He pointed out that I didn't look okay, asking why I went to the hospital. I collapsed onto the couch, telling him I thought I was having a heart attack, but the doctor said it was caused by extreme stress. He sat down beside me, closer than he'd been in weeks. He sounded genuinely rattled, asking if I was all right and what the doctor said. For a brief moment, I looked at him differently. Not as the 24-year-old who spent $28,000 of my money on his girlfriend's rent, but as the 14-year-old kid I met the day I married Eleanor, the boy who once asked if I could teach him how to fish. His eyes looked red, and he seemed genuinely shaken, telling me not to scare him like that, saying he didn't want to lose me. He hadn't used my name in years, usually just calling me old man. My hand instinctively twitched toward my wallet, that old urge to fix everything, to provide, to protect them. Then those 53 bank pages flashed across my mind. The numbers laid out on the kitchen table, the $130,000, the late-night transfers, the social media post, the picture of my labeled food in the fridge with his mocking caption. My hand froze, and I pulled it back. I told him I was fine, and thanked him for asking. He admitted he was terrified about everything, about the 14 days, finding a place to live, and how they were going to afford it. I looked him straight in the eye and told him he should have been terrified 14 months ago, before he made that very first transfer to Chloe. His face fell. He realized right then that I wasn't going to soften up. My phone rang. It was Mike. He told me he just heard that old Pete got hurt at the Section 3 tower when his safety catch failed, falling 30 feet, and that they were airlifted him to Dallas. I asked how bad it was. Mike reported broken vertebrae, possibly worse, noting Pete was only 54 and had been working with us for 20 years. I swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the news. Mike added that what happened on that line today could have been any of us, or even me this morning. I hung up and sat in complete silence. Old Pete, 54, potentially paralyzed, career over after 20 years on the grid. What did he get for it? A broken body that only worked when it felt like it. Maybe a modest pension if he survived until 62. Here I was at 58, giving 30 years of my life, carrying chronic pain, hearing loss, scarred hands, and now a hospital wristband. Dr. Reynolds' words echoed in my ears. Next time, it might be the real thing. All those sacrifices for what? So my wife could get cosmetic injections, and my stepson could fund his vain girlfriend. I didn't install any new locks that night, nor did I draft any new terms. I just sat in the workshop until midnight, sanding down a piece of pine that didn't even need sanding. When my mind couldn't rest, my hands knew what to do. Old Pete would survive his injuries, and I survived my crisis. But both of us got a stark reminder. Time isn't infinite. I refused to spend whatever time I had left living as a resource for others to mine. Day 12. The very first time in years I spent a full weekday at home, not on vacation, not a storm day, but a doctor-ordered day of rest. On Friday, day 11, I stayed inside, took the blood pressure meds Dr. Reynolds prescribed, sat on the porch drinking coffee, and let my body recover. Eleanor and Julian both avoided me. The house was quiet, and I desperately needed that quiet. By Saturday morning, I felt emotionally steady and clear-headed. The pressure in my chest was gone, and my hands stopped shaking. 11 days had passed, leaving 3 days left on the 14-day deadline. The math was simple, even if the coming conversation wasn't. At 9 in the morning, I was in the workshop organizing tools. When your mind won't settle, organizing gives your hands something to focus on. The door opened. Eleanor stood there without a drop of makeup, wearing an old sweatshirt I'd only seen her wear for yard work. She looked 60 instead of 49. She begged me to talk. I set my wrench down and turned to face her, agreeing to listen. She walked into the workshop and pulled the door shut behind her, a private conversation. Her voice sounded raspy as she admitted she couldn't take it anymore, sharing that Martha left that morning after calling her weak and telling her she should have fought harder. I asked her what she was supposed to fight for, staying to claim half my property in Texas? She claimed she meant fighting for us, for the marriage, for staying together, calling me cruel. I took a deep breath, knowing this was the conversation we needed to have. I told her to sit down. She took a seat on the high stool in the workshop while I stayed standing, not to loom over her, but to keep a firm stance. I told her I wanted to make one thing crystal clear. I was not throwing anyone out, but rather ending a financial arrangement that was completely broken. She argued that both amounted to the exact same thing. I told her no, speaking slowly and deliberately. I told her that cruelty was draining someone's retirement saving over 14 months without saying a word. Cruelty was lying every single time she was asked where the money went. Cruelty was letting her son's girlfriend spend someone else's money, while that person worked 60 hours a week in thunderstorms, completely oblivious to it. Her face went pale as she asked what I was talking about. I kept going, telling her that cruelty was forging documents, gambling with someone's future, and mocking them on social media. She claimed she didn't do those things. I told her softly that she did. She broke down, claiming she never meant for things to turn out this way. I told her good intentions don't change the damage done. I picked up my notebook and started writing as I spoke, offering to show her what my actual proposal looked like. I laid out the real numbers on paper. Actual monthly cost of them living here added up to $2,000 in market rent, $350 for utilities, heat and internet, $250 for property taxes and insurance, and $500 for groceries, a total real cost of $3,100 a month. Then I pointed to my request, $1,500 a month, which saved them $1,600 by staying. I slid the paper across to her. I pointed out that I was asking for less than half the actual cost, stating that wasn't cruelty, it was generosity. She stared at the numbers, claiming they didn't have $1,500. I told her that was their problem to solve: get a full-time job, have Julian get a job, cut expenses, or find another place to live. She accused me of punishing them for being a family. That was the breaking point. I told her family doesn't steal from each other, lie, hide things, or manipulate. I said if their actions weren't family behavior, then it was pure exploitation, making it clear I wasn't punishing them, but protecting myself. My voice softened a bit, but stayed completely firm. I told her that on Thursday, 80 feet in the air, I thought I was having a heart attack. I told her they rushed me to the ER, ran tests, and held me for 3 hours. The color completely drained from her face as she realized I had been to the hospital. I explained it was a severe panic attack, but the doctor warned that at 58, with my family history, the next one could easily be a real heart attack. I told her the doctor ordered me to resolve the source of stress before it killed me. I reminded her that my father died at 58 from work-related strain, and now I was 58 myself. Every day I climbed those power towers could be my last. I told her I realized I didn't want to spend whatever life I had left being used by others, emphasizing that it wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation. She cried. Real tears this time. Not manipulation, but pure exhaustion. She sobbed that she didn't know how to fix it. I told her I gave her the terms, and whether she met them was up to her. If she couldn't, they had to leave, and we would both start over. She asked if it was really that simple after everything we'd been through. I told her yes, precisely because of everything we'd been through. She left the workshop completely defeated. I sat there for a while until a thought struck my mind. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting at the small desk in my bedroom. The computer hummed while November rain tapped against the window pane. A thought had crossed my mind during lunch. The smart doorbell camera, I'd installed it months ago. It was motion activated and saved footage to the cloud. I realized I hadn't checked the footage since May. I opened the app on my phone. Months of archived video sat waiting. I decided to start scrolling back from October. October looked normal, the mailman, me coming and going. September, I scrolled through the dates. September 18th, 10:17 a.m. motion detected. The video loaded. A young woman in her 20s wearing sunglasses and holding a Starbucks cup walked right up to my front door and used the keypad lock to walk inside. The timestamp read 10:17 a.m. while I was out on the job site. My heart rate spiked. I scrolled forward. September 20th, 11:42 a.m. The same woman walked in, bringing 2 other girls with her. September 24th, 1:23 p.m., the same woman. September 27th, 10:55 a.m., same story. A clear pattern emerged. Weekdays between 10 o'clock a.m. and 3 o'clock p.m. while I was working on the power grid. I checked August, same pattern 3 or 4 times a week. July was the same. In June, her first appearance showed up on June 12th. For over 4 months, Chloe Davis, Julian's girlfriend, wasn't just taking my money. She was regularly coming and going from my house while I was at work. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a cold, sharp anger. I clicked another clip from September 18th at 4 o'clock p.m. Chloe was leaving, and the camera clearly caught her face along with Julian seeing her off. Julian was even popping champagne at the front door with a group of her friends, celebrating something right there on my porch, right on the video feed. I downloaded 30 clips, saved them onto a USB flash drive, and labeled it Evidence. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. She wasn't just living in a luxury apartment I paid for. She was treating my ranch like her personal hangout spot. Meanwhile, I was covering the electricity, water, heating, and groceries. While I was climbing utility poles in storm weather, she was inside my house using my Wi-Fi and drinking my alcohol without anyone ever telling me a word. I saved those clips onto 2 separate drives, one for myself and a backup in case I needed a lawyer. But as I sat in that darkening room listening to the rain outside, a realization hit me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires surprise, and after everything I'd uncovered over those 12 days, I was far past being surprised. I was just completely, thoroughly done with it all. Day 14, the final day of the deadline, Tuesday morning at 5:30 a.m. I was brewing coffee in the kitchen when Eleanor appeared in the doorway, clearly having barely slept. Dark circles hung under her eyes like bruises, her hair was messily draped over her shoulders, and an old coffee stain marked her sweatshirt. Her hand trembled as she gripped the doorframe. Without any warm-up, she issued a sharp warning, claiming I was going to regret this. I poured my coffee into the thermos I'd used for 30 years, keeping my composure steady. I told her maybe I would, but noted I regretted the last 14 months far more. I added that when she sat alone in that big house eating dinner by herself, she'd wish things were different. She cut in, claiming she'd already been eating dinner alone for months, adding that I just never noticed. I looked at her calmly, telling her I noticed. I just stopped bringing it up. That afternoon, Julian tried a different angle. He cornered me in the living room as I was heading out to the workshop, arms crossed tight, full of defiance. He paced back and forth, taking 3 steps, turning and pacing back, his voice rising with every sentence. He declared that fine, they would leave, and made sure everyone knew what I'd done. I stopped and looked at him, waiting, asking what exactly I did. He yelled that I was abandoning my family and kicking them out over money. I told him he could tell whatever story he wanted, but suggested he better mention the $130,000, along with sneaking Chloe into my house to throw parties behind my back. He shouted back that nobody was going to care about that. I told him that meant he had nothing to worry about then. He opened his mouth, closed it, turned on his heel, and stormed upstairs. Day 15. They didn't move out. Wednesday lunch break, the sun was struggling to cut through November clouds. I was sitting on a bench outside the equipment shed at the yard when my phone rang from an unknown Dallas number. I answered, confirming my name. The caller identified themselves from the fraud verification department at the county deeds office, calling regarding suspicious recent activity on my property. I tense up instantly, setting my sandwich down, asking what kind of activity. She informed me someone submitted an application for a $75,000 home equity line of credit against my property, complete with a power of attorney form carrying my signature. She noted it was submitted at 9:43 that morning, and because it involved a large equity drawdown, they were performing a routine check. My jaw clenched tight. I instructed her to reject it and freeze the application immediately. She explained that the applicant was my wife, and she provided a document appearing to hold my signature. I told her it was a forged signature, instructing her to freeze any requests coming from her or her number immediately. There was a brief pause before the caller professionally confirmed they would process the hold right away, advising me to contact the police promptly since it constituted serious mortgage fraud. I thanked her and hung up. Mike was sitting nearby eating his sandwich, asking if there was trouble. I told him they tried to take out a loan against my house using a forged signature at the last minute. Mike shook his head, noting that desperate people do reckless things, muttering a quiet curse. When I got home that evening, the harsh fluorescent lights were glaring in the kitchen. Dirty lunch dishes were piled in the sink. Eleanor stood by the counter holding her phone. The second she saw me walk in, her face fell. She looked like she'd been caught red-handed. Her makeup was smudged, the polish was peeling off 3 of her fingernails, and she looked like she was right on the edge of a breakdown. She looked at me, her voice barely a whisper, realizing the county recorder's office had called me. "I did," she said, shifting into a defensive posture, her chin held high. She snapped that they needed that money for a down payment, claiming they couldn't rent a place anywhere else. I told her to borrow against her own credit then. She screamed that her credit cards were completely maxed out. I remarked that it sounded like a vicious cycle. She began to yell, a real, raw scream that echoed off the tile walls. She shrieked that I was intentionally making things hard for them and deliberately backing them into a corner. I kept my voice low and steady, telling her no, I was simply no longer funding their lifestyle. Day 16, Thursday. I was in the hallway preparing to go upstairs to change out of my work clothes when I heard Julian on the phone in the living room. His voice carried through the open door. He begged his friend Brad to let him crash at his place for a few days, claiming there was a situation at home. There was a pause, followed by Brad's faint voice coming through the speaker, making excuses about being really busy and suggesting Julian ask someone else, before asking if they were still going to that music festival next week. Julian sounded anxious, realizing he couldn't go, asking Brad if he actually couldn't go, or if he just didn't want him around. Silence followed before Brad admitted he thought they needed some space, pointing out that Julian had been bringing too much drama lately, and bringing up the $2,000 Julian still owed him. The call disconnected. I heard Julian's breathing go short and shallow before he dialed another number, trying to reach someone named Matt. Another refusal followed, backed by the exact same excuse of being too busy. He made call after call, but not a single person was willing to take him in. I heard the sound of him swiping through his phone, checking social media, followed by a short, broken gasp as he realized his fair-weather friends had completely abandoned him. Day 17, Friday. Julian found me out in the workshop. I was sanding down the walnut bookshelf I'd been working on for weeks. It was nearly finished, solid wood with tight joints, sawdust dusting the floor, while the air smelled of pine rosin and mineral spirits. He stood in the doorway, with red rims around his eyes and messy hair. He asked with a sharp, bitter tone if I was happy now that I had turned everyone against him. I didn't stop sanding. The steady rhythm helped me think. I told him I hadn't spoken to a single one of his friends. He yelled, asking why everyone was dodging him, pointing out that even Chloe wasn't picking up his calls anymore. I suggested that maybe they were never his real friends to begin with, asking if they only liked what he could buy or the high-end apartment he leased. He shouted that it wasn't true. I finally looked up and set the sandpaper down, asking him when was the last time he did something with them that didn't cost money, like grabbing a coffee at their place or taking a walk in the park, or if it was always expensive restaurants, nightclubs, and parties. His face completely fell as the rage drained right out of him, like water leaking from a broken cup. I told him the money was gone, Julian, and clearly so were they. He began to cry. Real tears this time, not manipulation, but the crushing weight of reality setting in. He sobbed that he thought Brad was his best friend. I told him his best friend wouldn't vanish the second his credit cards got maxed out. I reminded him he had his mother and himself, adding that should be enough. That afternoon, I heard noise coming from upstairs, dragging footsteps, cardboard boxes scraping across hardwood floors, and the sharp metallic screech of packing tape being ripped from a dispenser. I went up to check. Julian's bedroom door was wide open, with empty cardboard boxes stacked against the wall, some taped shut, others open and half filled with clothes and shoes. He was folding clothes and carefully stuffing them into a duffel bag, while Eleanor wrapped picture frames and newspaper in the background. Julian kept folding clothes without looking up, stating they were packing because they didn't have the money to stay, acknowledging that I already knew it. I told him I knew. He muttered that I won. I told him it was never about winning or losing. He asked what it was about then. I told him it was about survival. Day 18, holding a registered letter in my hand containing a document that would force me to decide whether to involve the police. Day 18. The sound of packing tape echoed through the rooms that were soon to fall silent. It was Saturday at 10 in the morning. I had gone out to buy heavy-duty contractor trash bags, the kind that wouldn't split even when packed full. When I returned, the house had completely transformed. Cardboard boxes were everywhere, stacked in the hallway and lined up along the living room walls, brown, identical, and anonymous. The $3,000 espresso machine was gone, sold yesterday for $1,500. A stranger drove up in a pickup to haul it away while I was at the yard. The spot where it used to sit was left completely bare and clean. Eleanor and Julian were upstairs. I could hear their muffled voices discussing what to keep, what to sell, and what to leave behind. At 12:30, I was making lunch, a simple turkey sandwich, when I heard the doorbell ring. It was the mailman requiring a signature for a registered letter. The return address made my heart sink. First Mortgage Servicing of Dallas. I hadn't carried a mortgage in 10 years. I signed for it, closed the door, and stood in the hallway holding the envelope. Upstairs, Eleanor let out a short laugh at a comment from Julian, a sound that felt completely out of place. I tore open the envelope. It was a copy of the approval documents for a home equity line of credit cash-out application. My name was at the top with the correct property address, requesting a loan amount of $75,000. I scanned down to the signature line, Arthur Vance. Except I had never signed it. The handwriting looked similar. Someone had practiced it, but the capital A was wrong, and the slant on the V in Vance was off. Attached was a notarization page stamped by a notary I didn't even recognize, a forgery. The application date was October 3rd, right in the middle of my 14-day ultimatum. They had tried to take out a mortgage against my house, the property I spent 30 years paying off, without saying a single word to me. If the county recorder's office hadn't done a secondary check due to the large out-of-town request, and if the loan company had approved it based on that forged signature, I would have woken up one day owing $75,000 on a debt I never agreed to. My hands didn't shake, which surprised me. I thought they would, but I felt cold, calm, and entirely sober. At 1:15, I called Marcus Thorne, the lawyer Mike had recommended 3 weeks ago. I'd kept his card in my wallet, not thinking I'd actually need it until now. He answered on the second ring, stating Thorne Law Firm. I introduced myself and told him I needed legal counsel. He instructed me to go ahead. I laid out the entire situation, the $130,000, the 14-day ultimatum, and now this mortgage cash-out application with a forged signature, attempting to saddle me with debt I never authorized. He went quiet for a moment before stating that what I was describing was mortgage fraud, a serious felony involving grand larceny and forgery of legal documents that carried a prison sentence of 2 to 10 years if prosecuted. I asked him what I should do. He advised me to file a police report today, explaining that even if I didn't want to press charges right now, I needed it on record to protect myself if they tried anything else with my name or credit, adding that the final decision to prosecute was mine. I thought it over and told him I didn't want revenge. I just wanted them gone and out of my life for good. He told me to file the report, keep the evidence, and let them know what I held, noting that sometimes that was more than enough. At 2 o'clock, I walked upstairs. Eleanor was in her bedroom folding clothes into a suitcase. She looked up when I walked in, catching sight of my face and the letter in my hand. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her ghost white. She whispered my name. I held up the letter, pointing out the $75,000 home equity cash-out request with my forged signature and a fake notarization. She opened her mouth, closed it, and stared at the floor. I asked her straight if she did it or if Julian did. Her voice came out barely audible, claiming they were desperate and needed the money to stay, pay the rent I demanded, and cover the card debts. I demanded to know who actually signed it. She admitted that she did. A heavy silence filled the room. She tried to justify it, claiming it was our house, and she was just tapping into our shared equity. I told her plain that it was my house, my name on the deed, fully paid off by me, protected under Texas law as separate property. I pointed out that she tried to steal $75,000 by forging my signature on legal documents. She protested that she wasn't stealing. I told her she was committing mortgage fraud, a felony carrying 2 to 10 years in prison. She sat down heavy on the bed, her legs giving out beneath her. I told her I'd called a lawyer an hour ago who advised me to file a police report to document the crime and protect myself. Her eyes went wide as she asked if I was going to have her arrested. I told her I was filing a report for the record, and whether charges were pressed was up to me. She begged me, please. I kept my voice completely level, telling her I wasn't looking to prosecute, not because she didn't deserve it, but because I didn't want the hassle of spending the next year in court, testifying, or having my life tied to hers any longer. She began to cry, real tears mixed with pure relief and deep shame. I warned her sternly that if she and Julian weren't moved out by Monday morning, or if she ever touched my name, credit, or mortgage again, I wouldn't hold back. I told her I'd press charges using every piece of evidence I had, the bank statements showing 6 figures drained, the doorbell footage of Julian's parties, and the forged letter in my hand. She nodded silently, unable to speak. I walked downstairs and dialed the non-emergency line for the Amarillo Police Department, filing a report for attempted mortgage fraud and forgery. They took down my statement and noted an officer would follow up on Monday. I had enough evidence to legally ruin them, but as I sat in the workshop that night, listening to their hushed voices through the wall, Eleanor's tired tone and Julian's bitter replies, I realized something important. Revenge wouldn't erase 30 years of physical wear on the power grid. It wouldn't fix my hearing loss or heal the scars on my hands. Revenge belonged to people who still cared enough to fight. I just wanted my house and my life back. Day 21. The final deadline was no longer a threat. It was a sweet relief. I woke up at 5:30, just like every other workday, even though I was taking time off. 30 years of a 5:30 alarm doesn't disappear overnight. I lay in bed, waiting. At 6:15, I heard the rumble of a U-Haul moving truck backing down the driveway, its reverse beeper sounding through the morning quiet, followed by the sound of doors opening and muffled voices. I got up, brewed coffee, and watched from the kitchen window. Eleanor and Julian were already loading up early. They had probably been awake since 4, packing final boxes and taping them shut. At 8:30, Martha's Range Rover pulled in. She stepped out, cast a disdainful look toward my pickup in its usual spot, bypassed the front door, and went straight to help load the truck. I went out to the workshop. The walnut bookshelf was nearly complete. I'd originally planned to take 3 months on it, but over these past weeks, sanding the wood helped clear my head. The simple physical act of smoothing the timber provided a steady comfort. I could see the driveway through the workshop window as they packed up boxes, suitcases, and trash bags stuffed with clothes, along with a cheap particle board bookshelf that never stood straight. They worked in complete silence, no talking, just the sound of cardboard scraping against metal and heavy grunts of effort. Martha handled most of the heavy lifting, while Eleanor looked exhausted and pale. Julian kept his head down, dreamily hauling armfuls of clothes on hangers into the back of the truck. They left behind the furniture I owned before I ever met Eleanor, the worn sofa I was used to, and the kitchen table with the slightly wobbly leg. At 2 o'clock, I made a turkey and mustard sandwich, standing at my workbench to eat while I watched. By 2:45, the U-Haul was fully packed. They closed the roll-up door and snapped a padlock shut. The 3 of them stood in the driveway talking. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw the gestures. Martha pointing at the house, Eleanor shaking her head, Julian staring at the ground with his arms crossed. Then Eleanor turned and walked toward the workshop. I set my sandpaper down, wiped my hands on my jeans, and waited. She knocked 3 times, soft and hesitant. I opened the door. She stood there in a gray hoodie and jeans, no makeup, hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking 60 years old or older. She simply said they were leaving. I told her I knew. A long silence hung between us as she looked past me at the bookshelf, the tools hung on the pegboard, and the neatly stacked scrap wood. She quietly remarked that things didn't have to end up this way. I countered that it didn't have to start that way either. Her jaw set tight, but she didn't argue. She offered a quiet apology for the lies and for everything. I believed she was sorry things turned out like this, sorry she lost, and sorry she was moving into a cramped, cheap rental in Fort Worth at 49 years old. But I didn't think she was sorry for what she did, only sorry she got caught. I told her an apology didn't change what happened. She nodded, looking down at her hands, peeling nail polish, dry skin, hands that used to be soft. She noted that I looked a lot lighter. I thought about it and told her I felt lighter. She expressed hope that I'd find what I was looking for. I told her I already found it. She waited for me to explain, but I stayed quiet. She turned to leave, paused, and looked back to ask if I ever needed anything. I cut her off with a single, firm word, no. She understood, turned back toward the truck, and climbed into the passenger seat. Martha took the wheel, while Julian squeezed into the middle seat between them, staring straight through the windshield. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, overloaded suspension sagging low. The truck jerked forward, Martha shifted gears, and it rumbled down the driveway onto the main road, turned left, and vanished. I stood in the workshop doorway, watching until it was out of sight, and listening until the engine noise completely faded away. Then I walked back inside my house. It felt completely different, larger, emptier, but not a bad kind of empty. It was an open emptiness that made me notice the space, the light pouring unobstructed through the windows, and the quiet air. I walked through every room, the living room with my sofa, my coffee table, and my books resting on the shelves. The massive flat-screen TV was gone, leaving only the bare wall mount and a dark rectangular outline on the paint. In the kitchen, my plates rested in the cabinets, and my coffee maker sat on the counter. The labels I'd slapped on the fridge items were still there. I peeled them off and tossed them in the trash. Upstairs, Julian's room stood totally empty, poster marks lingering on the walls alongside dust outlines where his furniture used to sit. Eleanor's closet was bare, save for a few wire hangers and a single shoebox left on the top shelf. I pulled it down and opened it to find old photos of her with her ex-husband and a baby Julian. I closed the box and set it out by the trash bin on the curb. I sat down in my reading chair by the window, the same chair Martha had sat in 2 weeks ago trying to make me feel small. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. No raised voices, no footsteps stomping upstairs, no loud TV blaring in the background, no arguments over money, no one demanding my time, help, or cash. Just the quiet furnace kicking on, the fridge humming, and the clock ticking on the wall. I had spent 2 weeks forcing this moment to happen. 2 weeks of setting boundaries, confrontations, and sleepless nights, listening to them plot behind closed doors. Now that the moment was finally here, I didn't feel a sense of grand victory. I felt open, as if someone had thrown wide the windows of a house that had been sealed tight for too long. The November air was cool and crisp, but clean. For the first time in 14 months, I could breathe easy. On my first night living alone, I locked my bedroom door out of old habit before realizing I didn't need to anymore. No one was going to test the doorknob at 3 in the morning or search my wallet while I slept. There was nobody else there. I unlocked the door and left it cracked open an inch, letting the rest of the house breathe. Day 22, Tuesday. I woke up at 5:30 out of habit, but instead of rushing to brew coffee and head out the door, I sat at the kitchen table and watched the sunrise. Soft orange light filtered through the bare branches in the backyard. I made myself a real breakfast, bacon, eggs, and toast. The rich, savory smell of bacon grease filled the house. Eleanor used to hate that smell, complaining that it lingered for days, so I had stopped cooking it. Now, I fried up a full pound and sat at the table eating while reading yesterday's paper in peace. On Wednesday, I called in sick to the yard for the first time in 2 years. I spent the entire day out in the workshop, finishing the walnut bookshelf, sanding it smooth, applying 3 coats of polyurethane, and sanding lightly between coats. By late afternoon, it was complete, tight joints and a smooth finish that caught the light beautifully. I stepped back to look at it, feeling a quiet sense of pride, a simple, grounded satisfaction in creating something good with my own hands. On Thursday, Mike called to ask if I was working Saturday. I told him I had the day off. He asked if I wanted to head down to Horseshoe Lake for some fishing, noting he hadn't been since September. I thought about it and told him I'd love to. Saturday morning at 6, I met Mike down at the reservoir. It was cold, around 40 degrees, our breath misting in the crisp air. We sat along the east bank with our lines in the water, drinking coffee from thermoses, not needing many words. After an hour, Mike remarked that I looked completely different. I told him I felt different. He asked how so. I told him if I felt lighter. He pointed out that I'd smiled twice this morning, noting he hadn't seen me smile in months. I reeled in my line, cast it back out into the water, and admitted that I didn't realize how heavy the load was until I finally put it down. Mike nodded slowly, understanding without needing any further explanation. On Sunday, I invited Mike over for dinner, the first time I'd hosted anyone since Eleanor left. We grilled steak on the back porch, drank cold beers, and hung out in the living room around my furniture and my books. Mike remarked that the place felt completely different. I confirmed that it was. He asked if I planned on staying or selling the ranch. I told him I was keeping it. It was paid off and belonged to me, so there was no reason to leave. Mike raised his beer bottle to staying, and I clinked mine against his. Day 28, Monday. A full week had passed. I was out in the workshop planing a piece of oak for a side table I'd been meaning to build when my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but answered anyway. A quiet silence lingered before Eleanor's voice came through, smaller and quieter than I'd ever heard it before. I asked her what she wanted. She admitted they needed help, explaining that the 2-bedroom apartment they found had to be split between 3 people, her, Julian, and her sister Martha. I asked if Martha was living with them now, surprised that the Range Rover-driving middle-class sister was there. Eleanor confessed that Martha went broke after her real estate business failed, leaving her with nowhere else to go. I almost laughed out loud, noting that it sounded like a family trait. She pleaded with tears in her voice for me not to be like that. I waited in silence. She explained they were short on the $2,000 security deposit, adding that Julian got hired to stock shelves at a grocery store, but got fired after getting into a fight on his second day, while her hours at the gallery got cut, leaving them desperate. I paused before asking why she was calling me. She confessed it was because she had no one else to call and was out of options. I pointed out that, to her, I was only ever a bank account with a heartbeat. She protested that it wasn't fair. I kept my voice calm and steady, reminding her that she drained 6 figures from me, tried to mortgage my house behind my back, and let Julian's girlfriend throw parties in my home without my knowledge. I asked if she was really calling for money just a week after leaving. She claimed she wasn't asking for a handout, just borrowing $2,000 that she swore she'd pay back. I told her no, making it clear I was no longer her safety net, backup plan, or financial solution, and told her to figure it out herself. Her tone hardened as she claimed she thought I wouldn't cut her off completely and assumed I still cared. I told her I cared for 14 months while she took advantage of every single day, adding that I was done caring. She snapped that I was being cruel. I corrected her, stating I was simply being clear, noting there was a big difference. Another long silence stretched over the line. She muttered that she was wrong about me, claiming she thought I was a good man. I told her I was a good man, just not to people who stole from me. I added that if she wanted to remember it that way, she could, but made it clear I didn't care to dwell on it at all, and hung up. I stood there holding the phone for a minute, waiting to feel a wave of guilt or an urge to fix things like I used to, but nothing came. I set the phone down, picked up my hand plane, and went right back to work on the oak timber. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen, writing down a simple list of things I wanted to do. Learn new woodworking techniques, go fishing every week, visit my daughter Sarah in Colorado, whom I hadn't seen in 3 years because of constant overtime, fix the back porch steps, and get a dog, maybe a blue heeler. A simple list of 5 things I'd put off for years because I was exhausted, stressed, and consumed by the endless drain of money, time, and energy. Now I had time, energy, and my life back. I looked down at the list, my goals, and my future. That was what real freedom felt like: quiet, unpretentious, and completely mine. Day 35. I thought the hardest parts were behind me until Julian's Lexus pulled back into my driveway. It was a Tuesday evening in early December, 20 minutes after sunset. I'd just returned from the grocery store in my Ford pickup, carrying 2 bags of basic supplies, the kind of groceries I could buy without needing to double-check my bank balance. As I walked toward the front door, I heard his engine. Julian pulled in aggressively, shot off the ignition, and stepped out with his usual arrogant air. He wasn't smiling. His presence alone was a statement. I set the grocery bags down on the porch step and stayed put, asking what he wanted. He sneered, calling me a jerk for kicking them out over a little bit of money. I kept my voice steady, reminding him I gave them 14 days and clear terms that they chose to reject. Julian took a step forward, asking if I thought that made me the good guy for throwing family out over cash. I told him draining someone's accounts and trying to take a fraudulent mortgage on their house behind their back didn't count as family behavior, noting I had the bank records and county documents to prove it. He didn't deny it. He just stepped closer until I could smell cheap tobacco on his jacket. He demanded I fix things by giving his mom the $2,000 deposit money and apologizing for being selfish. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and hit the dial pad. Julian stopped mid-sentence, asking what I was doing. I held up a finger, brought the phone to my ear, and heard the line connect. I spoke clearly to the 911 dispatcher, giving my name and address at 207 Horseshoe Lake Road, reporting an individual trespassing on my property and making threats, requesting an officer be sent over. Julian's eyes went wide as he realized I was calling the police. I ignored him while the dispatcher asked if I was in immediate danger. I replied that he was standing in my driveway making threats and refusing to leave, a male in his 20s driving a Lexus named Julian. Julian swore under his breath, turned on his heel, and rushed back to his car. He started the engine, glared at me through the window, and threatened that I'd regret this. He slammed on the gas, backing out so hard his tires kicked up gravel across the driveway. The police arrived 10 minutes later. I showed the two officers my previous incident report, the forged mortgage letter, and the doorbell footage. They advised me to file for a restraining order, which I did at the county courthouse the very next morning. The threats were officially over. Now, the healing could truly begin. December turned into February and February into April. The seasons shifted, and so did I. The house still felt large, and on some mornings the silence was heavy, but it was a peaceful silence, no longer the tense, walking on eggshells atmosphere of those 14 months. In that quiet, I could hear my own thoughts again, breathing easy without counting the cost. On the first Wednesday of December, Mike convinced me to join the guys for breakfast at Rosie's Diner, 6:30 in the morning, an hour before shift start. The place smelled of bacon grease and dark coffee, filled with line workers and retired truck drivers sitting in the corner booth. Old Ray, the senior lineman, looked up, recognizing me and noting I was single again, remarking on how news travels in a small town. I told him I made it through. Old Ray nodded and poured me a cup of coffee without pressing for details, the quiet respect of small-town men who simply accepted me back into the fold. That Wednesday breakfast ritual became my anchor, a $6.50 meal of eggs, toast, and coffee, 45 minutes of talking sports and weather before heading out to work. Simple, grounded, and exactly what I needed. In late January, I adopted a blue heeler pup and named him Wrench. Every morning while I brewed coffee, he'd lay on his mat in the kitchen, wagging his tail, a small joy that meant the world. Toward the end of January, I checked my bank balance out of habit, and the numbers on the screen made me pause. $4,200. For the first time in 14 months, my checking account held over $4,000. I stared at it for a long time. Storm overtime pay minus basic expenses left a steady surplus every month. No mysterious withdrawals. No late-night cash advances to some stranger named Chloe. Just my money, growing quietly and steadily in my account. In April, I did something I hadn't done in years. I treated myself to a $280 pair of brand-new Red Wing work boots. I felt zero guilt. It was my money and my choice. I'd spent 2 years wearing worn-out boots to save money for a family that never saved a dime for me. That realization no longer made me angry. It just made me feel a gentle sympathy for the man I used to be. In May, I saw Dr. Reynolds for a routine checkup. She looked over my chart, glanced over her glasses, and told me to keep doing whatever I was doing. I'd lost 15 pounds, my blood pressure was down, I was sleeping 7 hours a night instead of 4, and the chest tightness was completely gone. By late June, I realized over 100 days had passed since Eleanor's last phone call. No calls, no texts. I hadn't thought about her in weeks. No anger, no regret. She just hadn't crossed my mind. I understood then that this was what healing felt like. By the end of the 8th month, I had over $20,000 in my savings account. My house was entirely mine, my truck ran smooth, my income was steady, and my financial security was fully restored. I was 60 years old. I'd spent 30 years on high-voltage lines, a few years in a broken marriage, and 8 months learning what real peace felt like. Peace felt like a morning cup of coffee without tension, fishing without checking the clock, and sitting in the yard with Wrench in the sun. Peace was simple, and I realized simplicity was profoundly underrated. 8 months was enough time to heal from old wounds, but not enough to erase them. It was a Saturday afternoon in September, one of those warm autumn days, with a cool breeze blowing through the open workshop door, carrying the scent of dry grass. I was putting the final coat of varnish on an oak side table, listening to country music on the radio, feeling a deep, genuine contentment. A soft, hesitant knock sounded at the screen door. I looked up to see a woman standing outside, taking a full second to recognize who it was. It was Eleanor, but completely transformed. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, showing gray streaks she no longer bothered to dye, no salon color, just natural aging. Lines marked her face without a trace of makeup, showing a deep tiredness etched into her skin from months of hard labor. Her hands were rough, red, and calloused, her nails short and bare. She wore faded jeans that looked like thrift store finds and a plain t-shirt. Everything about her posture signaled defeat and humility. I set my sandpaper down and removed my safety glasses. I called her name quietly. She offered a faint greeting, asking if she could come in. I hesitated for a second, before nodding and pushing the screen door open. She walked in, her eyes scanning the neatly organized tools in the workshop, remarking that I'd been staying busy. I told her keeping busy was good for the soul. I pointed toward the old high stool by the window. She sat down while I leaned against the workbench. I asked her how she knew I'd be out here. She offered a faint smile, noting it was a Saturday afternoon and remembering that I always loved spending time in my workshop. She crossed her hands over her lap and then opened them palm up toward me, quietly saying she wasn't there to ask for money. I offered a simple, okay. She shared that she was working 2 jobs now, the morning shift at a drive-thru and night shifts cleaning motel rooms. I noted that sounded like grueling work. She agreed, slowly turning her hands over to display the wear and tear, rough skin, cracked and calloused from scrub brushes and harsh detergent. She admitted her hands hurt constantly, and when she got home, there was nothing left inside. No energy, no money, just an empty space. She paused, looking at me, noting that must have been how I felt for 14 full months, coming home completely drained every single day. I nodded and told her that was exactly how it felt. She admitted she finally understood what I meant about setting boundaries and what it felt like to be used. I asked her what brought about the change. She explained it was working 70 hours a week just to scrimp together rent and basic living expenses, counting every single dollar. She added that she and Julian were fighting constantly over money, with Julian now working as a loader in an Amazon warehouse. She revealed that Chloe dumped him 2 months after he moved out of my house, the exact moment he could no longer lease luxury apartments or send transfers her way. I told her I was sorry to hear that. Eleanor looked at me in genuine surprise, asking if I was truly sorry. I clarified that I was sorry he got hurt, but not sorry that situation ended, pointing out that Chloe had been using him all along. She stopped, swallowed hard, and admitted it was just like they had used me. It was the first time she'd ever stated it so directly. Tears welled up in her eyes, not the manipulative tears I'd seen in the past, but the quiet, heavy tears of pure exhaustion. She assured me she wasn't asking to move back, acknowledging that door was closed forever. I kept my tone gentle, confirming that yes, it was closed. She explained she just needed me to know that she finally saw what they had taken from me. I thanked her for telling me that. She looked around the workshop and asked if I was happy. I looked around at my neatly arranged tools, the projects I was completing on my own schedule, and Wrench wagging his tail out by the door. My house, my life. I told her I was far better than fine, explaining that I was finally free. She nodded as her tears kept falling, offering a quiet wish that I'd find someone who truly deserved me. I told her I wasn't looking, but thanked her anyway. A long silence settled between us before Eleanor stood up, saying she should get going, but just needed to apologize in person, telling me she was deeply, truly sorry. I told her I believed her, noting I thought she was genuinely sorry now. I added that I wished she'd felt that way 14 months ago, but recognized that personal growth runs on its own timeline. We walked to the door together. Eleanor paused right at the threshold, sharing that despite how things ended, she really did love me in the beginning. I answered honestly, telling her I knew, and that I loved her too, but reminded her that love without respect is never enough. She stepped outside and cast one last glance back, telling me to take care. I told her to take care as well, meaning every word. I watched her walk over to her car, a beat-up Honda Civic with faded paint and a dented bumper. She climbed in, the engine coughing twice before kicking to life. She backed out of the driveway slowly, offering a single wave through the glass. I raised a hand in response, a polite farewell, not an invitation. The car turned onto the main road and vanished. I walked back to my workbench, picked up my sandpaper, and went right back to smoothing the walnut bookshelf. My focus returned completely to the present moment. Eleanor was officially a part of the past. October rolled around again, marking a full year since that safety gear card got declined, a year that changed absolutely everything. Wednesday morning at 5:45 a.m. I woke up naturally without an alarm, sitting on the edge of the bed, with my feet planted flat on the cool wooden floorboards. I stretched my back, feeling the familiar ache 30 years of high-altitude line work had carved into my spine, my knees creaking as I stood up. My body wasn't young anymore, and it hadn't fully restored itself, but I had rested, a deep, genuine rest I hadn't experienced in years. I walked barefoot into the kitchen and brewed coffee as usual, dark roast, 2 sugars, letting the rich scent fill the quiet house. I carried my mug out to the front porch and sat on the swing I'd repaired back in March. 6 o'clock brought the sunrise, temperatures hovering around 48 degrees, cold enough to leave a thin layer of frost across the grass. Wrench rested right at my feet. Mrs. Peterson walked by with her golden retriever and gave a friendly wave, and I waved back, the calm, familiar rhythm of a small town. I sat there sipping my coffee, reflecting on this exact date 1 year ago. The safety gear shop, the declined card, the confusion, embarrassment, and the start of an awakening. If someone had told me back then where I'd be today, sitting on my own porch enjoying my own peace, would I have believed them? Probably not, but here I was. At 4:45 p.m., I stopped by the Amarillo hardware store after shift to grab a replacement pair of utility pliers for $47.50. Same store, same cashier behind the register. She scanned the barcode, and I handed her my card, a different card now, tied to my personal account. The machine chimed with an instant approval, the cashier wishing me a good evening. I wished her the same. A small moment, but it still mattered. A year ago, that transaction failed. Today, it went through effortlessly, a complete full circle. If you've stayed with me through this entire family story until the very end, I want to share something important. I'm no hero. I'm just a 60-year-old power grid worker who finally learned how to say no. Life gave me 30 years up on the towers and a year on solid ground to figure out what truly mattered, and it took me long enough to get there. This story was never about winning. It was about surviving with your dignity intact. Looking back on those 14 months, I see a man who confused love with obligation, assuming being a provider meant sacrificing everything, including his own self-respect. Don't make that mistake. Don't wait until your accounts hit zero and your chest tightens 80 feet in the air to realize you've been living for everyone else's comfort but your own. Some people might call this a comeback, but that implies wanting to hurt the people who wronged you. I never wanted that. I just wanted my life back. That isn't revenge, it's self-preservation. The hardest lesson I learned is that setting boundaries isn't cruel, saying no isn't abandonment, and walking away from people who drain you isn't selfish. It's pure survival. This story was simply about taking back what was mine all along. Family isn't just a title you're automatically handed. It's earned through respect, honesty, and genuine mutual care. No title or legal paper gives anyone the right to bleed you dry. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever felt like someone's personal cash machine, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Feel free to share this journey with anyone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more honest conversations about boundaries and finding peace. Thank you for listening all the way through. I truly appreciate every single one of you. As a quick note, upcoming stories may feature elements adapted for perspective and narrative depth. If those don't suit your taste, feel free to explore other videos on the channel. Take good care of yourselves. You deserve to be treated right.